The dust of Dry Creek settled on everything, a fine brown powder that coated the soul. It blew in from the plains on a wind that offered no relief from the sun, a sun that beat down on the town like a hammer on an anvil, forging the day into a shape of shimmering, relentless heat. There was no creek, dry or otherwise. Not for years. The name was a cruel joke left over from a time when hope had a place here, before the water vanished and left the earth cracked and gasping. Now, the only thing that flowed was whiskey, and the only hope was for a good hand of cards or a fast horse out of town. Into this desolation, Clara came. She was 19 years old, an orphan passed from one uncaring hand to the next until she landed in the care of her uncle, a man whose heart was as barren as the land around them. He was a gambler, and like all gamblers who pray to a merciless God, he had finally lost a wager he could not cover with coin. So he had paid with flesh and blood. He had paid with Clara. She stepped down from the stagecoach into the glare of the afternoon, and a hush fell over the handful of onlookers loafing on the boardwalk. They saw the dress first. It was meant to be a wedding gown, made of white cotton with lace at the collars and cuffs, a thing of delicate intention that was utterly lost in this coarse settlement. The dust immediately began to claim it, dulling its brightness, turning the hem a mournful shade of gray. Then they saw her face. Her skin was pale, her features fine, but her eyes were what held them. They were the color of a twilight sky, vast and empty, hollowed out by a grief so profound it had swallowed any light that might have been left in her. She was a bride with no joy, a sacrifice dressed for the altar. The whispers started then, rustling through the heat like dry leaves. The women, standing in the shaded doorways of the mercantile and the dressmaker's shop, saw the truth of it. They saw the girl's trembling hands, the set of her jaw, the way she stood as if waiting for a blow. They felt a pang of pity, a sour, useless thing that they swallowed down with a sigh. They knew what this was. They had seen it before. A debt paid, a bargain struck, a young woman's life traded like a deed to a worthless plot of land. They knew, and they did nothing. To interfere was to invite trouble, and trouble in Dry Creek had a way of ending with a shallow grave and a forgotten name. The men saw something else. They saw a piece of property, a pretty thing brought in for the town's wealthiest, most brutish man. They looked at her the way they looked at a fine new mare, appraising her lines, her spirit or lack thereof. There was no pity in their eyes, only a flat, knowing calculus of possession and power. Virgil Crane stepped out of the saloon to claim what he had bought. He was a thick, bull-necked man who had built an empire on horse breeding and fear. His face was florid from sun and whiskey, his eyes small and hard. He wore a tailored coat and polished boots that seemed to mock the grimy street. He smiled, a wide, wet smile that did not touch his eyes, and took Clara's arm. His grip was not gentle. It was a brand, a mark of ownership for all to see. "There she is," he boomed, his voice carrying across the street. "Prettier than the letter promised. A bit skinny, but we'll put some meat on those bones." Clara flinched but did not pull away. She had learned long ago that resistance only made things worse. Silence was her only shield, a thin, brittle armor against the world's casual cruelty. She allowed him to lead her down the boardwalk, her wedding dress dragging in the dirt. He flaunted her, steering her past the blacksmith's shop and the assayer's office. His hand clamped firmly on her arm. He wanted the whole town to see. He wanted them to know that he was a man who took what he wanted, that her life was now another one of his acquisitions, no different from the prize stallion in his stable. She endured his roughness in silence, her gaze fixed on the splintered planks beneath her feet. She counted them. 1, 2, 3, a rhythm to anchor her while her soul drifted away, seeking a place where she could not be touched. When he finally led her into the saloon and up a set of rickety stairs to a room at the back, she did not look at him. "This is where you'll stay until the preacher says the words tomorrow," he said, his breath hot and sour with liquor. "Don't you go getting any ideas about leaving. He gestured around the small, stifling room. It had a bed with a tarnished brass frame, a washstand, and a single window that overlooked a filthy alley. It was a cage. He gave her arm one last, painful squeeze and then left, locking the door from the outside. The sound of the key turning in the lock was the sound of her world shrinking to 4 walls. That night, and for the few nights that followed, she wept. She waited until the raucous noise from the saloon below had faded into the snores of drunken men. And then she let the tears come. They were silent, desperate tears for her parents, lost to fever when she was just a child, tears for a life she had never been allowed to choose. She would cry until her throat was raw and her eyes were swollen, and then she would fall into a shallow, haunted sleep, only to wake to the same suffocating reality. A few days later, Calder Branson rode into town. He came from the north, a solitary figure on a buckskin horse. Dust settled into the lines of his face and the folds of his worn clothes. He was a rancher, a man who kept to himself on a spread of land that bordered the Badlands. There were stories about him in Dry Creek. They said he had lost a woman, a fiancée, years ago in a fire set by bandits. They said the fire had taken her and a piece of his soul, leaving him scarred and silent, a man who preferred the company of cattle to that of people. He lived alone, and that was the way he seemed to like it. He hitched his horse outside the mercantile and went inside to trade for flour, coffee, and cartridges. He wasted no words, his voice a low rumble that was used to speaking to the wind and not much else. As he was leaving, he saw Virgil Crane and Clara emerge from the hotel restaurant. Virgil was holding her arm again, pulling her along. Her steps faltered, and he gave her a sharp, impatient yank. "Hurry it up," Virgil snarled, his voice low but sharp enough to carry, "I ain't got all day to be parading you about." Clara stumbled, her face pale. She said nothing, merely righted herself and quickened her pace to keep up with his angry stride. Calder watched from the mercantile doorway. He saw the possessive grip, the flash of irritation in Virgil's eyes, and the girl's blank, resigned expression. He saw the way she seemed to fold into herself, making herself smaller, less visible. A muscle tightened in his jaw. He knew men like Virgil Crane, men who saw the world as a collection of things to be owned, to be broken. He felt a familiar, bitter taste in his mouth, the taste of old anger, of a fight he had lost a long time ago. But he did nothing. He turned away, untied his horse, and loaded his supplies. It was not his concern. He had learned the hard way that stepping into other people's trouble was a good way to get yourself killed, or, worse, to get someone else killed. He had made a vow over a grave marked by a simple wooden cross that he would never again be responsible for another person's safety. He would look after his own, and the rest of the world could sort itself out. He swung into his saddle and rode out of town, the image of the girl's hollow eyes following him for a mile before he forced it from his mind. That night was the eve of the wedding. Downstairs in the saloon, Virgil Crane was celebrating his good fortune. He bought rounds of drinks for any man who would listen to him boast. He was loud, expansive, his laughter echoing off the smoke-stained walls. He drank whiskey after whiskey, his mood growing fouler and more belligerent with each glass. The men around him laughed at his jokes and slapped his back, but they kept a wary distance. They knew his temper. Calder had decided to stay the night in town rather than make the long ride back in the dark. He'd taken a room at the far end of the hall from Clara's, a small, cheap space that suited his needs, but sleep wouldn't come. He lay on the lumpy mattress, listening to the noise from below, the whiskey-fueled shouts and the tinny piano. He was trying not to think about the girl, but her face kept appearing behind his closed eyes. He told himself it was none of his business. Her uncle had sold her. The town had accepted it. The law, such as it was in Dry Creek, had nothing to say about it. She belonged to Virgil Crane now. Upstairs, Clara sat on the edge of her bed, her hands clenched in the fabric of her simple shift. She could hear Virgil's voice rising above the din, a thick, slurred roar. Every time he laughed, a tremor of fear ran through her. Tomorrow, the preacher would say the words. Tomorrow, there would be no locked door to protect her. The thought was a cold stone in her stomach. She felt a desperation so sharp it was like a physical pain. She looked at the window. It was a long drop to the alley below. For a fleeting, terrible moment, she considered it. The sound of heavy, stumbling footsteps on the stairs snapped her out of her trance. Her heart leaped into her throat. It was him. He was coming. She scrambled back on the bed, pulling the thin quilt up to her chin, her eyes wide with terror. A key fumbled in the lock. Then the door crashed open. Virgil stood there, swaying, his face dark with drink and something far uglier. His eyes were glazed, fixed on her. Time for an early wedding present, he slurred, a cruel smirk twisting his lips. No sense in waiting for a preacher's permission to inspect the goods. He lurched toward the bed. No, Clara whispered, the word barely audible. Please, wait until tomorrow. Her plea only seemed to inflame him. I've waited long enough, he growled, reaching for her. Clara fought. It was not a calculated act of defiance, but a pure animal instinct for survival. She kicked and clawed, her nails raking his face. He roared in pain and surprise, and his hand cracked across her cheek. The force of the slap sent her head snapping back, and stars exploded behind her eyes. The side of her face went numb, then burned with a white-hot agony. He grabbed the front of her shift, the fabric tearing in his fist. She opened her mouth and screamed. It was not a plea for help, for she knew none would come. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated terror, a final, ragged protest against the violation that was about to consume her. Down in the saloon, the scream sliced through the noise. Most of the men ignored it, shaking their heads or making a crude joke about a bride's wedding night jitters. But Calder heard it, and it was a sound he knew. It was the sound of a soul being torn apart. It was the sound he heard in his nightmares. He was moving before he knew why. The vow he had made, the walls he had built around his heart, they all shattered in an instant. He shoved his chair back, the legs scraping loudly on the floor, and was up the stairs in 3 long strides. The door to her room was open. He saw it all in a single, sickening glance. Virgil on top of the girl, her shift torn, her face a mask of terror, her small hands pushing uselessly against his massive chest. Something cold and ancient ignited in Calder's gut. He crossed the room and seized Virgil by the collar, hauling him off the bed with a single, brutal motion. Virgil, caught off guard, stumbled backward, bellowing in rage. "What the hell do you think you're doing, Branson? This is my property!" Calder didn't answer with words. He answered with his fist. He drove it hard into Virgil's jaw, the crack of bone a sharp, satisfying sound. Virgil staggered back, shaking his head to clear it, and came at Calder, his arms swinging wildly. The brawl was short and ugly. Virgil was bigger and fueled by drunken rage, but Calder was faster, harder, his movements honed by a life that had demanded he know how to fight. He moved inside Virgil's clumsy swings, landing 2 more punishing blows to the man's gut, doubling him over. As Virgil gasped for air, Calder brought his knee up sharply, connecting with his chin. Virgil's eyes rolled back in his head, and he collapsed to the floor, a dead weight, unconscious before he landed. The room was suddenly, shockingly silent. Calder stood over the body, his chest heaving, his knuckles raw and bleeding. The commotion had drawn a few men from the saloon. They stood clustered in the doorway, their face pale in the lamplight, watching with a silent, morbid curiosity. Calder turned his head and fixed them with a glare so full of contempt it was like a physical blow. "Get out," he said, his voice dangerously low. The men shuffled their feet, then melted back into the shadows of the hallway, leaving him alone with the aftermath. He turned back to the room. His gaze fell on Clara. She had huddled herself into the corner of the bed, against the wall, as far away from the scene as she could get. The quilt was pulled up to her neck, and she was shaking. A violent, uncontrollable trembling that seemed to shake the very frame of the bed. A thin line of blood trickled from her lip where she had bitten it, and the red imprint of Virgil's hand was beginning to bloom on her cheek. Her eyes were wide, fixed on him, filled with a mixture of terror and a confusion so deep it was heartbreaking. He took a slow step toward her, holding his hands up, palms out, as if approaching a spooked animal. "It's all right," he said softly. "He won't touch you again." His voice seemed to break the spell. A single, ragged sob escaped her lips. She shook her head, her gaze dropping to her trembling hands. The words came out in a whisper, a broken, splintered sound, each one a shard of glass. "Just one night," she breathed, the words lost in a shuddering gasp. "I just want one night to sleep without shaking." It was the smallest, most desperate plea he had ever heard. It asked for nothing but a moment of peace in a life that had clearly known none. It was not a request for rescue, but for a brief, fleeting sanctuary. Something in Calder's chest, a place that had been hard and frozen for years, seemed to crack. He looked at her, this broken girl in her tattered shift, and he saw not a stranger's problem, but a duty he could not turn away from. The vow he made was forsworn. The solitude he had cultivated was breached. He simply nodded, a short, decisive movement. "Come on," he said, his voice quiet but firm. He turned and walked toward the door. He paused, looking back at the unconscious form of Virgil Crane, then at the silent, watching doorway. He felt a sudden, profound disgust for this room, for this town, for the men who stood by and did nothing. He reached up, took off his hat, and with a flick of his wrist, sent it spinning to the floor in the middle of the room. It landed with a soft, final thud in the dust. It was a gesture of contempt, of finality. He was leaving a piece of himself here, the part that turned away. Then he looked at Clara, his eyes holding hers, offering no promises, no pretty words, only a dark, uncertain path away from this hell. "Let's go." He led her through the dark, sleeping streets of Dry Creek, a ghost of a town under a spill of cold starlight. She followed a pace behind him, a small, trembling shadow wrapped in a coarse wool blanket he had taken from his own room. The torn shift she wore offered little protection from the night's chill, but it was the cold inside her that made her teeth chatter. Every sound, the creak of a shutter in the wind, the distant howl of a coyote, sent a fresh tremor through her. She kept her eyes on his back, a broad, solid shape moving with quiet purpose through the darkness. He was a stranger, a man who had met violence with greater violence, and yet she followed him. She had nowhere else to go. They left the last of the town's sad, slumping buildings behind and walked into the open country. The air grew cleaner, scented with sage and dry earth. He led her to a place she never knew existed, a tiny cabin nestled in a hollow between two low hills, nearly invisible until you were upon it. It was little more than a one-room shack, built of rough-hewn logs chinked with mud, but it had a sturdy door and a stone chimney that promised warmth. Inside, the air was cool and still. Calder moved with a quiet efficiency, striking a match and lighting a lantern. The soft, yellow glow pushed back the shadows, revealing a Spartan interior, a narrow bed built into the wall, a small table with one chair, and a cold fireplace. He did not speak to her. He simply moved to the hearth, knelt, and began to build a fire. He laid the kindling and logs with a practiced hand, and soon a small flame flickered to life, crackling and spitting, casting dancing shadows on the walls. Clara stood by the door, clutching the blanket around her shoulders, a prisoner of her own fear. She watched him, her rescuer. He was big, his shoulders straining the fabric of his shirt as he worked, his hands competent and sure, but there was a harshness to his face in the firelight, a grim set to his mouth. She saw the raw, scraped skin on his knuckles and remembered the sound of his fist hitting Virgil's jaw. He was capable of the same brutality as the man he had saved her from. The thought sent another wave of trembling through her. When the fire was burning steadily, he rose and turned to her. He seemed to fill the small room. For a moment, their eyes met, and she saw something in his gaze, not pity, not kindness, but a deep, weary sorrow, as if he were looking at a hurt he understood too well. "The bed is yours," he said, his voice a low rumble. He gestured toward the narrow cot. "There are extra blankets in that chest." He then turned his back on her, giving her a privacy she hadn't expected. He took the single chair, dragged it over to the door, and sat down. He picked up his rifle, which he had leaned against the wall, and laid it across his lap. He stared into the fire, his profile stark and unmoving. Clara hesitated, then shuffled toward the bed. Her body ached, and the side of her face throbbed with a dull, persistent pain. She pulled the extra blankets from the chest. They were clean and smelled of pine, and wrapped them around herself, quilt and all, before lying down on the thin mattress. She did not undress. She lay there, a tight, cocooned bundle of fear, and watched him. He sat like a statue, a sentinel guarding the only exit. He was her jailer and her protector all at once. The confusion of it was a dizzying weight in her exhausted mind. Sleep, the thing she had so desperately craved, was a distant country she could not find her way to. As the fire crackled and the cabin grew warm, her mind, untethered by exhaustion, began to drift back, pulling her into the cold waters of memory. She was a little girl again, holding her mother's hand as they walked through a field of wildflowers. Her mother's laughter was the sound of sunshine, her father's smile a safe harbor. Then came the fever, a thief in the night that stole the warmth from their bodies and the light from their eyes, leaving Clara an orphan in a world that suddenly had sharp edges. The relatives came, their faces pinched with duty. She was passed from one to the next, an unwelcome parcel. There was Aunt May, whose sighs filled every room, a constant reminder of the burden Clara was. She ate her meals in the kitchen, separate from the family, and her clothes were always hand-me-downs, too big or too small. Then there was Cousin Elias, a grim, silent farmer who worked her as hard as any hired hand, her small fingers growing raw from chores that were too big for them. In all those years, no one had ever held her just to hold her. She had learned to live in the margins of other people's lives, to make herself small and quiet, to expect nothing. The final betrayal had come from her uncle, her mother's brother, a man with restless eyes and a deck of cards always in his pocket. He had taken her in with a smile that never reached his eyes, and for a few months, she had allowed herself a sliver of hope. Then the men had started coming to the house, men with hard faces and cold eyes, demanding payment for his gambling debts. One evening, her uncle had sat her down at the kitchen table. He was sweating, though the night was cool. He couldn't meet her eyes. He had pushed a piece of paper toward her. It was a contract. She saw her name, and another name, Virgil Crane. "He's a wealthy man." "Clara," her uncle had said, his voice slick with false cheer. "A horse breeder. He'll give you a good life, a better life than I can." She had looked from the paper to his face, and in that moment, she saw the truth. She was not being given a new life. Her life was being used as payment. She was a stack of chips pushed to the center of the table to cover a losing hand. The memory of his signature, a black, scrawling thing that signed her away, was seared into her mind. That was the moment the hollowness had settled into her eyes for good. A log in the fireplace collapsed, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. The sound startled Clara back to the present. She looked across the room. Calder had not moved. His head was bowed slightly, and she thought he might be asleep. But then he shifted, his hand tightening on the stock of his rifle. He was awake. He was watching the fire. Calder was not thinking of sleep either. He was staring into the flames, but he was not in the cabin. He was in another time, another place, surrounded by a different fire, a fire that had consumed everything he loved. He saw Emmeline, her hair the color of corn silk, her laugh the sound of a clear running stream. They had been building a life together on his ranch, a small, hopeful thing in a vast, indifferent land. He remembered the feel of her hand in his, the way she had looked at him, as if he were the only man in the world. He had believed they were safe. He had believed his love was enough to protect her. The bandits had come at dusk, drawn by the sight of their horses. They had not been interested in negotiation. They had been interested in taking. Calder had fought, but there were too many of them. They had knocked him unconscious and left him for dead. When he came to, the house was a roaring inferno. He could hear her screaming his name. He had tried to get to her, crawling through the smoke and the searing heat, his own flesh burning, but the roof had collapsed, burying his world in a mountain of fire and ash. He had woken up days later, his body scarred, his soul incinerated. He had buried what was left of her under the big oak tree on the hill, and at her grave, he had made a vow. He would never again allow himself to be responsible for another soul. He would never again love something he could not protect. The pain of that failure was a constant, cold companion. He had retreated into himself, into his work, building a wall of solitude around his heart. And now, this girl, he had broken his vow. He had heard her scream and he had acted, pulled into the vortex of another's trouble by an instinct he thought he had long since buried. He had brought her here, to this place of refuge, and now he was responsible for her. The weight of it settled on his shoulders, heavy and familiar. He looked at her small form huddled under the blankets. She was just a girl, breakable and lost. He felt a surge of anger, at Virgil, at her uncle, at the whole rotten world that chewed up and spat out the innocent. And he felt a deeper, colder fear, the fear that he would fail again. He tightened his grip on the rifle. He would not fail this time. He would get her to safety, and then he would walk away. He had to. It was the only way to keep his ghosts at bay. Sometime before dawn, exhaustion finally claimed Clara. She fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. When she awoke, it was to the smell of coffee. The first light of day was filtering through the cabin's single small window, a pale gray wash. Calder was standing by the fire, pouring coffee from a blackened pot into a tin cup. The fear returned instantly, sharp and metallic in her mouth. Virgil, he would be awake by now. He would be looking for her. "I have to go," she said, her voice a rough whisper. She sat up, the blankets pooling around her waist. Calder turned. He looked at her, his expression unreadable. He did not argue or try to reassure her. He simply nodded. "I figured you would." He drank his coffee in silence while she scrambled to her feet. She was still in the torn shift, and a flush of shame warmed her cheeks. She smoothed the fabric as best she could and ran her fingers through her tangled hair. She felt like a stray, wild thing. Outside, the air was cold and crisp. The sun was not yet over the horizon, but the eastern sky was ablaze with streaks of pink and orange. Calder moved to his horse, which was tied to a nearby tree, and began to saddle it. He worked with the same silent competence as before, his movements economical and precise. Clara stood by the cabin door, her arms wrapped around herself, watching him. Her mind was racing. Where could she go? She had no money, no family, nothing but the torn clothes on her back. She could try to find work in another town, but a lone woman was an easy target, and Virgil would be hunting her. His pride had been wounded, and a man like that would not let such an insult go unpunished. The thought of him finding her made her feel sick. Calder finished with the saddle and turned to face her. The horse stood ready, his breath pluming in the cold air. "You have a choice," he said, his voice even. "The road south leads back to the way you came. You can take it and run on your own. I won't stop you." He paused, letting the weight of his words settle. "Or you can ride with me. I'm heading north. It's rough country, but he won't follow you there." It was the first real choice she had been given in years. It was a stark choice. A choice between two terrifying unknowns. To go alone was to be completely at the mercy of the world. To go with him was to place her life in the hands of a stranger, a man of violence and secrets. She looked at his face, at the hard lines etched by sun and sorrow, at the deep-set eyes that held no easy promises. She did not know if she could trust him, but she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she could not go back. She could not run alone. "I'll ride with you," she said, her voice barely more than a breath, but firm. He nodded once, as if he had expected it. He gave her a canteen of water and a piece of hardtack from his saddlebags. There was no room for her on his horse, so she would have to walk. He did not offer small talk or comfort as they set off, with him riding slowly and her walking beside the horse's head. The rising sun cast their long shadows behind them as they moved north, away from Dry Creek, away from the life that had almost claimed her. They traveled for days through a landscape that was both beautiful and brutal. They crossed dry canyons where the rocks shimmered with heat and the silence was broken only by the cry of a hawk. They traversed wind-blasted plains where the grass was sparse and bleached yellow by the sun. It was a land that did not suffer fools or the weak. Calder kept his distance, but he was quietly attentive. He found water in places that looked utterly barren. He shot a rabbit for their supper one evening, skinning and cooking it with a skill that spoke of a long familiarity with survival. He never spoke of his past, and he never asked about hers. He created a space of silence between them, and in that silence, a strange and fragile sense of safety began to take root in Clara's heart. He asked nothing of her, not even gratitude. He simply moved forward, and she followed. One night, they made camp in the shelter of a rock outcropping. The fire he built pushed back the immense, star-filled darkness of the plains. Clara sat huddled in her blanket, watching the flames. She had been following him blindly for days, living moment to moment. But now, in the quiet of the night, the question that had been hovering at the edge of her thoughts finally demanded to be asked. "Why?" she said, her voice soft. He looked up from the knife he was sharpening. "Why what?" "Why did you help me?" she asked, her gaze steady on his. "You don't know me. You could have been killed. Why did you do it?" He stopped his work and looked into the fire, his expression thoughtful. For a long moment, she thought he would not answer. Then he spoke, his voice low and devoid of emotion, as if stating a simple, unalterable fact. No woman should ever be left screaming while men do nothing. His answer settled over her, profound in its simplicity. He had not saved her because of who she was. He had saved her because of who he was. He had acted not out of affection or pity, but out of a rigid, personal code. It was an answer she could understand, an answer she could, perhaps, even trust. It was not about her, and because it was not about her, she felt, for the first time, safe enough to speak of the fear that went deeper than Virgil Crane. "I was so scared," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "Not just of him. I was scared of becoming nothing, a person that things just happened to. My whole life, other people have been choosing for me. My aunt, my uncle, him. I never got to choose anything. I was afraid that if he did what he wanted, there would be nothing left of me to even make a choice." She looked down at her hands, twisting a loose thread on the blanket. She had never spoken these words aloud to anyone. Calder listened, his expression unchanged. He did not offer platitudes or easy reassurances. He did not tell her everything would be all right. He offered her only the hard, unvarnished truth of their situation. "I can't promise you what's waiting up ahead," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the fire. "I can't promise you a new life, or that you'll be safe forever." He looked away, out into the vast darkness that surrounded their small circle of light. All I can offer is safety for now. Back in Dry Creek, the story of what happened in that upstairs room of the saloon spread like a brush fire. It twisted and changed with each telling. In one version, the quiet rancher Calder Branson had gone mad with drink and tried to steal Virgil Crane's bride-to-be. In another, the girl, Clara, was a cunning seductress who had played both men against each other. But the men who had stood in the hallway, who had seen Calder's face and heard the finality in his voice, they told a different story, a quieter one that clung closer to the truth. They spoke of the girl's scream and the look of cold fury in Branson's eyes. Virgil Crane woke up with a head that felt like a cracked bell and a jaw that was a symphony of pain. But worse than the physical hurt was the humiliation. It was a poison that seeped into his bones. He, Virgil Crane, the man who owned half the valley, had been laid out cold in front of his own men, and his property had been stolen from under his nose. The girl was a thing he had bought and paid for. Her flight was not just an escape. It was a theft, an insult to his name and his power. The whole town was whispering, and he could feel their stares, a mixture of fear and a secret, satisfying pity that was worse than any open mockery. He would not be pitied. He would be feared. He stormed into the sheriff's office, a cramped, dusty room that smelled of stale tobacco. He threw a leather pouch heavy with gold coin onto the desk. "I want a warrant," he snarled. The sheriff, a paunchy man named Gable with weary eyes, looked at the pouch and then at Virgil's bruised face. A warrant for what? For him, Branson, for kidnapping and theft. Theft of what? Sheriff Gable asked, already knowing the answer. "My intended," Virgil spat. "She's mine. He took her." The sheriff sighed. He knew Clara was no more Virgil's wife than the saloon's piano was. No words had been said, no papers signed in front of a preacher. He also knew that the pouch of gold on his desk was more real than any law in this town. Justice in Dry Creek was a commodity, bought and sold like everything else. "I can't give you a warrant for kidnapping without a witness saying she was taken against her will," Gable said carefully. "But theft, that's another matter. Did she take anything with her? A horse? Money?" "She took herself!" Virgil roared, slamming his fist on the desk. Finally, they settled on a story. Virgil claimed she had stolen a small sum of money he had given her for wedding preparations. It was a lie, thin and transparent, but it was enough. The next day, a notice was nailed to the post outside the sheriff's office. It described Clara as a runaway, an absconder, and a thief. It described Calder Branson as her accomplice, and it offered a reward for their capture, a sum large enough to make a desperate man do desperate things. The notice was Virgil's vengeance, a legal fiction that turned Clara from a victim into a criminal and Calder from a rescuer into an outlaw. Miles to the north, ignorant of the price that had been put on their heads, Calder and Clara reached their destination. After days of travel through the harsh, open country, they entered a narrow valley, a green slash in the dry brown landscape, where a small creek, a real one, still trickled through a stand of cottonwood trees. Tucked against the far wall of the valley was the homestead. It was not much to look at. The main house was a small, solid cabin of weathered logs, but the porch sagged and a few of the shingles were missing from the roof. A barn stood nearby, its paint long since peeled away by the sun and wind, one of its doors hanging crookedly from a single hinge. The corrals were sturdy, but the fences that stretched out into the small pasture were in need of mending. It was a place of neglect, but not of abandonment. It was a place that had once been cared for, a place that was waiting patiently to be cared for again. "This is it," Calder said, his first words in hours. He dismounted and looked around, his face unreadable. "It was my father's. I've been working on it when I can—" Clara slid off the horse she had been riding, a gentle mare he'd acquired in a small settlement a day back. Her legs were stiff, her body sore from the unaccustomed travel. She looked at the rundown ranch, at the quiet valley, at the immense, silent sky above. It was the most isolated place she had ever seen. It felt like the edge of the world. For the first time in a week, she did not feel the constant, prickling fear of being pursued. Here, there was only silence and space. Calder saw to the horses while Clara stepped cautiously toward the cabin. The door was unlocked. She pushed it open and stepped inside. It was larger than the line cabin, with 2 rooms and an attic loft. It was also filled with dust and the ghosts of a life that had been abruptly paused. A layer of grime covered a sturdy wooden table and chairs. A fireplace stood cold and black. In the small bedroom, a bed was stripped bare, the mattress rolled up. It was a place of deep, profound loneliness. She did not know what he expected of her, what her role was in this strange, silent partnership. She was not his prisoner, but she was not free. She depended on him for everything: food, shelter, protection. The thought chafed at her, a familiar feeling of helplessness. But as she stood in the dusty main room, a different feeling began to surface. It was a small, fragile thing, but it was there. This place was not a cage. It was a possibility. That first afternoon, she found a broom and began to sweep. The work was simple, physical, and deeply satisfying. With each stroke, she cleared away not just the dust and cobwebs, but a little piece of the fear and inertia that had encased her for so long. She swept the floors until the planks were clean and pale. She took a rag and wiped down the table, the chairs, the mantelpiece. She found a pail and fetched water from the creek, her arms aching from the weight of it. And she washed the dirt from the single window until the late afternoon sun could stream through, illuminating the floating dust motes in the clean air. Calder came in as dusk was falling. He stopped in the doorway, his eyes taking in the transformation. He looked from the clean floor to her face, smudged with dirt, but set with a look of quiet determination he had not seen before. He said nothing, but he gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. He had brought in a box of supplies from a hidden cache in the barn. Inside were flour, beans, coffee, and a slab of bacon. He set them on the newly cleaned table. And so their life fell into a rhythm, dictated by the sun and the needs of the small ranch. Calder was gone from sunup to sundown, mending fences, clearing brush, working with an unceasing, relentless energy, as if he were trying to physically exhaust the demons that rode him. Clara, in turn, claimed the cabin as her domain. She found it was not enough to be safe. She needed to be useful. She learned through trial and error. Her first attempts at biscuits were hard as rocks. Her first time milking the 2 scrawny goats that lived in a pen behind the cabin. She ended up with more milk on the ground than in the pail. But she did not give up. She was clumsy at first, her hands soft and unaccustomed to labor. But she was driven by a fierce, quiet resolve. She learned to cook, to mend, to garden in the small, fallow patch behind the house. She found meaning in these simple things: the solid feel of the broom handle in her hands, the rhythmic work of kneading dough, the sight of clean laundry, a pair of his shirts and her own mended dress, flapping in the breeze. Each completed task was a small victory, a stitch in the fabric of a new self she was weaving day by day. She was no longer just a person that things happened to. She was a person who made things happen. She made the fire, she made the meals. She made this lonely cabin into a clean, warm space that felt almost like a home. They rarely spoke. The silence between them was a vast country they both inhabited. But it was no longer the tense, wary silence of the trail. It was a comfortable silence, a shared solitude. They would eat their evening meal at the table, the only light from a single lantern, the sounds of their forks scraping against the plates the only conversation. She would watch him sometimes, the way the light caught the silver at his temples, the way his calloused hands handled his fork with a surprising gentleness. She wondered about the woman who had died, about the grief that had carved the deep lines into his face. He watched her too, in small, stolen glances. He saw the life returning to her, the hollowness in her eyes being replaced by a spark of purpose. He saw the color in her cheeks, the new confidence in her movements. She was becoming stronger, and the sight of it stirred something in him, something he did not want to feel. It was a tenderness, a protective instinct that went beyond mere duty. It was a feeling that was dangerously close to hope. One evening, after a long day of work, they sat at the table, the aroma of the stew she had made filling the small room. A storm was gathering outside, the wind moaning around the corners of the cabin. A silence fell between them. But this time, it was different. It was not comfortable. It was charged, heavy with all the words they had not spoken. Clara looked at his hands resting on the table. They were strong, capable hands. They had saved her. They had also built this life, this fragile piece she had come to cherish. Without thinking, moved by a sudden, overwhelming need to close the distance between them, she reached across the table and laid her hand on his. His reaction was swift and sharp. He pulled his hand back as if her touch had burned him. The rejection was a physical blow, and she flinched, her face flooding with shame. She quickly withdrew her hand, her heart pounding. Calder would not meet her eyes. He stared down at the table, a muscle working in his jaw. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low, rough rasp, full of a pain that stunned her. "Don't," he said. "Clara, don't."
"I'm sorry,"
she whispered, her throat tight.
"I didn't mean—"
"It's not you," he cut in, finally looking at her. His eyes were dark with a torment she could not understand. "It's me. I will not be the man who ruins you too." The words made no sense to her.
"Ruin me? You saved me."
He shook his head, a bitter, self-mocking smile touching his lips.
"I bring ruin to things, to people. Everything I touch, I break. I am afraid. Clara, I'm afraid of myself. I'm afraid of needing you."
The confession hung in the air between them, raw and bleeding. He was not a stone pillar of strength. He was a man terrified of his own vulnerability, haunted by a failure so profound it had poisoned his soul. She saw him then, not as a rescuer, but as a man just as broken as she was, trapped in a different kind of cage. Her own pain and shame dissolved, replaced by a wave of empathy so powerful it stole her breath. And with it came a surge of strength she did not know she possessed. She would not be treated as a fragile, breakable thing. She had survived too much for that. She stood up, her chair scraping against the floor. Tears welled in her eyes, hot and sudden, but her voice when she spoke was clear and strong. "I was ruined long before you ever found me," she said, the words tearing from her throat. "I was ruined in 100 different ways, by 100 different hands. I was a ghost. You are the first person who has ever made me feel solid." She walked around the table and stood before him. He was still seated, looking up at her, his face a mask of conflict and surprise. She was trembling, not from fear, but from the force of her own emotion. She reached out, her hands shaking, and gently touched his cheek, the rough stubble scratching her palm. Then she leaned in and kissed him. It was not a kiss of passion, but of communion. It was soft, hesitant, her lips trembling against his. It was a kiss full of all the pain and loneliness and desperate yearning for connection that they both carried. It tasted of salt and sorrow. For a moment, he remained rigid, unmoving, and she thought he would push her away. Then, with a low groan that seemed to be pulled from the depths of his soul, he relaxed. His hands came up to grip her arms, not to push her away, but to hold her steady, to hold her there. The kiss deepened, a slow, aching exploration, a question and an answer all in one. He led her to the small bedroom. There were no words. None were needed. The lamplight cast a soft, forgiving glow on the room. It was a slow undressing of wounds, not just of clothes. Each layer of fabric removed was a layer of armor, of defense, discarded. When they stood before each other, it was with a raw, terrifying vulnerability. She saw the scars on his back and chest, faded white lines that told a story of old violence. He saw the faint bruise still visible on her cheek, the fear that still lingered in the depths of her eyes. He laid her down on the narrow bed, and his touch was impossibly gentle. It was not the touch of a man taking something, but of a man offering a piece of his own shattered soul in the hope that it might find a moment of solace against another's. Their coming together was not a storm of passion, but a quiet, desperate clinging, a search for human warmth in the cold, lonely darkness. It was a confirmation that they were alive, that they had survived. It was a silent promise that, for this one night, in this one room, they would not be alone in their pain. Afterward, as the storm broke outside, the rain lashing against the window pane, she cried. They were not the desperate, silent tears she had shed in the room above the saloon. They were tears of release, of grief for everything she had lost, and of a strange, bewildering hope for what she might have found. He did not speak. He simply held her, his arm a solid, comforting weight around her. He held her until the tears subsided, until her ragged breaths evened out into the quiet rhythm of sleep. She woke sometime later, the room dark, the storm having passed. She was nestled against his side, his steady breathing a comfort in the stillness. "I said one night," she whispered into the darkness, not knowing if he was awake. "Just one night of sleep without shaking. But now I don't know what I want." He was silent for a long time. Then she felt his hand find hers in the dark, his fingers lacing through hers. His voice, when he finally spoke, was low and heavy with a truth that was both a comfort and a sorrow. "I can't give you forever. Clara, I don't know how. I can't promise you anything." He paused, and his grip on her hand tightened. "But I can promise you tomorrow." The promise of tomorrow began to stack, one upon the other, like pages in a book. The days settled into a routine that was as comforting as it was demanding. The harshness of the land required their constant attention, and in the shared labor, in the rhythm of sunup and sundown, the space between Clara and Calder slowly began to fill. The sharp edges of their individual griefs began to soften, worn down by the simple, repetitive friction of a life lived together. Clara was changing. The transformation was not sudden, but a gradual unfurling, like a desert flower opening after a rare rain. Calder began to teach her things, not with the condescension of a master to a pupil, but with the quiet patience of a partner. He taught her how to ride the gentle mare properly, not just as a passenger, but as a rider. He showed her how to sit the saddle, how to use her legs to guide the horse, how to feel the animal's movements as an extension of her own. At first, she was timid, her hands gripping the pommel, her body stiff with fear. But day by day, she grew more confident. Soon, she was riding out into the valley on her own, the wind in her hair, a feeling of exhilarating freedom coursing through her. For the first time in her life, she was the one holding the reins. She was the one choosing the direction. He also taught her how to shoot. He brought out an old rifle one afternoon, a heavy, well-oiled weapon. He placed it in her hands, and she was startled by its weight, by the cold, impersonal feel of the steel. "I don't want you to ever have to use this," he said, his voice low and serious. "But I want you to know how. There's a difference between being helpless and choosing peace." He showed her how to load it, how to brace the stock against her shoulder, how to sight down the long barrel. Her first shot, aimed at a tin can on a fence post, sent a shockwave through her arm and shoulder, and the bullet kicked up dust a foot wide of the mark. But she did not shy away. She set her jaw, reloaded, and tried again, and again. She practiced until her shoulder was bruised and her ears were ringing. But the tin can finally flew from the post with a satisfying ping. She had discovered a strength in herself she never knew she possessed, a core of steel beneath the fear. And with this new strength, her voice returned. She began to speak more, to ask questions about the ranch, about the names of the wildflowers that grew by the creek. And one afternoon, while trying to shoo a stubborn goat out of her vegetable garden, the goat darted between her legs, nearly knocking her over. A sound bubbled up out of her, startling them both. It was a laugh, a genuine, unburdened laugh. It was a rusty sound, unfamiliar in her own ears, but it was real. Calder, who was walking up from the barn, stopped and watched her, a slow, rare smile touching his own lips. It was the sound of a spirit coming back to life. They were building more than a ranch. They were building a home, a fragile sanctuary held together by unspoken understanding. Calder, who had let the place fall into disrepair as a reflection of his own inner ruin, began to fix things. He replaced the sagging boards on the porch, the sound of his hammer a steady, reassuring beat in the quiet valley. He rehung the barn door and mended the fences until they were straight and strong. Clara, in turn, worked to soften the hard edges of their life. She mended the tears in his work shirts, her needle moving in and out of the rough fabric in a steady, calming rhythm, as if she were stitching their two solitary lives together. She found wild mint growing by the creek and brewed it into tea. She scrubbed the cabin until it shone, her hands growing calloused, but her heart growing lighter. The place began to lose its feeling of lonely abandonment. It began to feel like theirs. One rainy afternoon, unable to work outside, Clara ventured into the attic loft. It was a dark, cramped space filled with discarded items and thick with the smell of dust and time. In a corner, tucked inside a wooden crate, she found an old, leather-bound Bible. The leather was cracked, the pages yellowed and brittle. She opened it to the frontispiece. In elegant, faded ink, a name was written, Emmeline. Clara traced the letters with her finger. Emmeline. The name was a whisper in the silent attic, the name of the ghost that lived between them. She knew, with a woman's intuition, that this was the name of Calder's lost fiancé. She sat down on the dusty floor, the Bible in her lap, and felt a profound, aching sadness, not of jealousy, but of a shared womanhood, a sorrow for a life that had been cut short, for a love that had been turned to ash. She was still sitting there, turning the fragile pages, when Calder came up the ladder. He was looking for some old tools, but he stopped when he saw her, when he saw what she was holding. A shadow passed over his face, a look of such deep, unguarded pain that Clara felt her own heart clench in response. She quickly closed the book. "I'm sorry," she said, her voice soft. I found it." He did not get angry. He simply looked tired, as if an old, heavy weight had been settled back onto his shoulders. He came and sat on an old trunk opposite her, the rain drumming a gentle tattoo on the roof above them. "It was hers," he said, his voice flat. It was not a question. Clara nodded, clutching the Bible to her chest. "She had beautiful handwriting." He looked away, his gaze fixed on some distant point in his memory. For a long time, he was silent. Clara waited, sensing that this was a threshold, a door he had kept locked for years, and that he was now, for some reason, considering turning the key. When he finally spoke, the story came out in a low, measured tone, as if he were recounting something that had happened to another man, a long time ago. He told her about Emmeline, about their plans, about the small house they had built with their own hands on his other property, the one closer to the world. He told her about the bandits, about the fire. "I could hear her screaming my name," he said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, the words raspy with old agony. "I tried to get to her. The smoke was so thick, I couldn't see. The heat, it was like the whole world was on fire." He held up his left hand, and for the first time, Clara saw the faint, puckered scars that crisscrossed the back of it. The roof came down, just fell in, and the screaming stopped. He fell silent, but the story hung in the air, thick and suffocating as the smoke he had described. It wasn't just that they killed her, he continued, his voice rough with a self-loathing that was terrible to witness. It's that I couldn't save her. I was her man. I was supposed to protect her. And I failed. The last thing she ever knew was terror, and I was lying helpless in the dirt 100 feet away. He finally looked at Clara, his eyes hollow. That's the guilt I live with. That's the ghost. It's not just her. It's my own failure. Clara felt tears welling in her own eyes, not of pity, but of a deep, resonant understanding. His loss was a fire, hers a slow drowning, but the taste of the ashes was the same. They were both survivors of a past that had tried to erase them. She reached out and laid her hand on his scarred one. This time, he did not pull away. We both carry ghosts. Calder, she said softly. Mine followed me all the way from my parents' graves. Yours lives in the smoke. Maybe they don't have to haunt us alone. He looked down at their joined hands, then back up at her face, a flicker of something. Gratitude, relief, a shared sorrow passed between them. In that dusty attic, with the rain falling outside, they were no longer just a man and a woman bound by circumstance. They were two survivors, two souls marked by loss, who had found in each other a quiet harbor from the ghosts of the past. The fragile peace of their valley was shattered a few weeks later. They were asleep when a sound from outside startled them awake, the nervous whinny of a horse. Calder was out of the bed in an instant, pulling on his trousers and grabbing the rifle he always kept by the door. Stay here, he whispered to Clara, his voice tense. But Clara was no longer the frightened girl who had huddled in the corner of a saloon room. She slipped out of bed, her heart pounding, and reached for the other rifle, the one he had taught her to use. Her hands were shaking as she checked the load, but her eyes were steady, her movements sure. Calder was already at the window, peering out into the moonlit darkness. Two of them, he breathed, trying for the mare. Clara moved to stand beside him, the heavy rifle in her hands. She could see the dark shapes of two men near the corral, one trying to gentle the mare while the other worked on the gate latch. A cold fury, an emotion she had never truly felt before, rose up in her. They were intruders. They were trying to steal a piece of her home, of her new life. Before Calder could stop her, she lifted the rifle, propped the barrel on the windowsill to steady it, and took aim. Not at the men, but at the fence post just above their heads. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion of the shot was deafening in the quiet night. Outside, the men cursed in surprise, and the wood of the fence post splintered. The mare, terrified, reared up and galloped to the far end of the corral. The two men didn't hesitate. They scrambled for their own horses and fled into the darkness, leaving only the lingering smell of gunpowder in the air. Calder slowly lowered his own rifle and turned to look at her. She was still standing at the window, the rifle clutched in her hands, her knuckles white. She was trembling, but her gaze was fixed on the empty space where the men had been. He reached out and gently took the rifle from her hands. You're stronger than you think, Clara, he said, his voice full of a quiet awe. She looked up at him, her eyes clear and direct in the moonlight that streamed through the window. That's because you never treated me like I was weak, she replied. Meanwhile, 100 miles to the south, Virgil Crane was finally closing in. His frustration had festered into a cold, methodical obsession. The reward had turned up nothing but false leads from drifters looking for easy money. He realized that a man like Branson, a man who knew the wilderness, would not be easily found. He needed someone who knew how to think like him, how to track like him. He found his man in a smoky cantina across the border. His name was Silas Kane, and he was a bounty hunter with a reputation for patience and ruthlessness. He was a thin, wiry man with eyes the color of faded denim, eyes that missed nothing. For a price, he agreed to find the rancher and the girl. Kane was not a man who rushed. He spent weeks asking quiet questions, following the cold trail north, piecing together Calder's life from the whispers and rumors he found in isolated settlements and trading posts. He learned about the fire, about Calder's solitary nature, and, crucially, about the second homestead, the one his father had left him, a remote place no one ever visited. He brought the news back to Virgil, along with a hand-drawn map. Virgil's smile was a grim, predatory thing. He paid Kane his fee and then hired 3 more men, hard cases from the saloons, men who would do anything for coin and cared little for the law. His plan was simple. He would ride to the ranch under the cover of his false claim of theft. He would reclaim his property and deal with Branson permanently. It was not just about getting Clara back anymore. It was about eradicating the memory of his humiliation with blood. The news of the bounty on their heads came to the valley with a grizzled old trapper who was passing through. He shared his coffee by their fire one evening and, making small talk, mentioned the notice he'd seen in Dry Creek. He described it in detail, the false accusations, the reward. When he was gone, a heavy silence descended on the small cabin. The peace they had built felt suddenly fragile, a thin pane of glass about to be shattered. "We have to leave," Calder said, his face grim, his voice leaving no room for argument. "We can pack what we can and be gone by morning. Head further north into the mountains. They'll never find us there." It was the voice of a man who had lost everything once and was determined not to let it happen again. Clara looked around the small, warm room. She looked at the clean-swept floor, at the curtains she had stitched for the window, at the porch Calder had rebuilt with his own hands. This was more than a cabin. It was the first home she had ever known. It was the place where she had found her strength, her voice, herself. The thought of running, of abandoning it to men like Virgil, was a physical pain. "No," she said, her voice quiet but firm. Calder looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "Clara, you heard the man. He's hired a bounty hunter. He's coming. This isn't a fight we can win." "I have been running my whole life," she said, standing to face him, her eyes blazing with a fire he had never seen before. "I ran from my aunt's pity and my cousin's cruelty. I ran from my uncle's gambling debts. I was running even when I was standing still in that room in Dry Creek. I am done running." She took a deep breath, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. This is the first place on earth that feels like mine. It's not much. It's run down and lonely. But we built it back up. You and I will not let a man like Virgil Crane take it from me." Calder stared at her, truly seeing the woman she had become. She was not the broken, trembling girl he had led out of the saloon. She was a woman of strength and conviction, a woman willing to fight for what was hers. He felt a surge of pride so fierce it almost staggered him. He also felt the cold grip of his old fear. He was supposed to protect her. The safest thing to do was run. But he looked into her eyes and he saw not recklessness, but resolve. She was not asking for his permission. She was stating her will. And for the first time, he understood. Protecting her didn't mean making all her decisions for her. It meant trusting her to make her own. It meant standing with her, as an equal. He let out a long, slow breath, letting go of the fear, letting go of the sole responsibility he had carried for so long. He gave her a small, solemn nod. "All right, Clara," he said, his voice quiet, a promise and a vow all in one. "We stay, we fight." The decision to stay settled a new kind of silence over the valley. It was not the comfortable, shared solitude they had come to know, but a taut, watchful quiet, stretched thin over a chasm of fear. The sky seemed too bright, the birdsong too loud, the rustle of leaves in the cottonwoods a potential warning. Every day that dawned without incident was not a reprieve, but another turn of the screw, tightening the tension until they felt it hum in their bones. Calder moved with a grim, focused energy. The ranch was no longer a home to be restored. It was a fortress to be defended. He spent his days preparing, his face a mask of cold calculation. He was no stranger to this kind of thinking. It was the same mindset that had failed to save Emmeline, and he was now applying it with a desperate, penitent fury. He would not fail again. He showed Clara the valley's weaknesses, its points of entry. He spent a morning weakening the small wooden bridge that crossed the creek a half-mile downstream, sawing partway through the main supports. It would hold the weight of a man on foot, but not a horse. He dug a shallow pit on the narrowest part of the northern trail and covered it with a lattice of branches and a layer of dirt and leaves. A simple but effective trap that would break a horse's leg. Along the paths closest to the cabin, he strung thin wires low to the ground, tied to stacks of old tin cans that would rattle and clang at the slightest touch. These were not the traps of a soldier, but of a rancher, using the simple tools of his life for the grim business of war. His lessons for Clara became more intense, more urgent. They were no longer about building her confidence. They were about ensuring her survival. He took her to the edge of the woods and pointed out a dense thicket of elderberry bushes. "If they come in force, if I tell you to run, you come here," he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. "You don't stop. You don't look back. You get in there and you stay quiet until the sun comes up." He taught her how to reload the rifle in the dark, making her practice until her fingers were raw and the metallic clicks of the mechanism were second nature. And one evening, as the sun bled red over the western ridge, he took her out behind the barn for the final, most terrible lesson. He set up a scarecrow, a burlap sack stuffed with straw and dressed in one of his old, torn shirts. "Up until now, you've been shooting at cans," he said, his eyes hard as flint. "You've been learning to aim. Now you have to learn to kill." Clara stared at the lumpy, man-shaped figure, and a cold dread washed over her. "Calder, I can't—" "You can," he interrupted, his voice sharp. "You have to. If a man comes through that door, he is not there to talk. He is there to hurt you, to take you, to kill me. You cannot hesitate. You cannot think of him as a man with a family or a home. You think of him as a threat, an animal. And you put him down." He tapped a spot on the burlap sack, just to the left of center. "You aim for here, or here." He tapped the head. "You shoot. You work the lever. You shoot again. You do not stop until he is on the ground and he is not moving. Do you understand me?" She looked into his eyes, into the cold, dark place where his own ghosts lived, and she saw the terrible price of survival. She nodded, her throat too tight to speak. She raised the rifle, the scarecrow's blank, stitched-on face, a placid target in her sights, and she fired, again and again, until the burlap sack was a tattered, gaping ruin. She did not feel strong. She felt a piece of her soul turn to ice. That night, she could not sleep, while Calder lay in a restless, shallow slumber beside her. She slipped out of bed, by the light of a single, low-burning lantern. She took out a precious sheet of paper and a pencil stub she had found in a drawer. Her hands trembled as she began to write. She wrote to Preacher Evans in Dry Creek. He was a timid man, easily cowed by the likes of Virgil Crane, but she remembered a kindness in his eyes. He was her only hope. With a stark, unsparing honesty, she laid out the whole ugly truth. She wrote of her uncle's debt, of the contract that had sold her like livestock. She described Virgil's public humiliation of her, his roughness, and the terror of that final night in the saloon. She told of Calder's intervention, not as a kidnapping, but as a rescue, an act of decency in a town that had offered none. She confessed to fleeing with him, and she exposed the bounty as a lie, a vengeful fiction built on a non-existent theft. She wrote until her fingers ached and her tears had stained the paper, blurring some of the words. It was her testimony, her life, her truth, poured out onto a single sheet of paper. It was a desperate prayer sent out into the darkness. She folded it carefully and sealed it with a drip of wax from the candle. 2 days later, the old trapper, Jed passed through on his way back south. As he prepared to leave, Clara pulled him aside, pressing the letter and one of the few silver coins she possessed into his hand.
Please,
She whispered, her eyes pleading. This is for Preacher Evans in Dry Creek. It is a matter of life and death. If you get to town and you hear that there has been trouble out here, will you promise to give it to him? The old man looked from the letter to her pale, earnest face. He saw the fear in her eyes, and the steel beneath it. He had seen enough of the world to know the shape of trouble when he saw it. He tucked the letter and the coin deep into his coat. I'll see he gets it. Miss, he said, his voice a gravelly promise, you have my word. She watched him go until he was a tiny speck on the horizon, taking her last hope with him. After that, there was nothing left to do but wait. The attack came 4 nights later. The moon was a sliver, often obscured by scudding clouds. A deep, unnatural quiet had fallen over the valley. Calder felt it first. He sat up in bed, his head cocked, listening to the silence.
What is it?
Clara whispered from the darkness beside him. Nothing, he said, and that was what scared him. The crickets had stopped chirping. The night birds were silent. Then they heard it. A single, sharp clang from the direction of the creek. One of the tripwires. They were no longer a man and a woman in a bed. They were soldiers. They moved in the darkness with a grim, practiced efficiency, pulling on their clothes, grabbing the rifles. Calder went to the front window, peering into the gloom. Clara took her position at the smaller window in the bedroom, which overlooked the side of the house and the path from the barn. For a long time, there was nothing but the sound of their own breathing and the frantic beating of their own hearts. Then, a shape detached itself from the deeper shadows near the corral. Then another, and another. Clara counted 4 of them, moving in a low crouch toward the house. The world seemed to shrink to the small frame of the window. The first shot came from Calder. The flash of his rifle lit up the night, and the boom echoed through the valley. One of the figures cried out and fell, clutching his leg. The other 3 immediately scattered, diving for cover and returning fire. The air was filled with the deafening roar of gunfire. Wood splintered from the cabin walls as bullets thudded into the logs. A slug tore through the window near Clara's head, showering her with glass. She flinched back, her heart hammering against her ribs, but she remembered Calder's words. She was not helpless. She was a defender. She saw one of the men trying to circle around toward the back of the house. He was using the old water trough for cover, taking a deep, shuddering breath. She rested the barrel of her rifle on the sill, found his shadowy form in her sights, and fired. She did not wait to see if she had hit him. She immediately worked the lever, the metallic sound a small, solid piece of reality in the chaos, and prepared to fire again. The man yelled a curse and scrambled back into the darkness, limping. She had hit him. The thought brought her no triumph, only a cold, sickening resolve. The fight raged on, a brutal exchange of fire from the shadows. Calder was a pillar of deadly calm, firing with a measured, lethal precision. He wounded a second man, who dragged himself away, leaving a dark trail on the ground. They were holding them off. A wild, desperate hope began to flicker in Clara's chest. Then, one of the thugs made a desperate rush for the porch. He burst out of the darkness, a big, bearded man, firing his pistol wildly. Calder was reloading. Clara was closer. She swung her rifle toward the door, but the man was already there. He kicked the door, but it held, barred from the inside. He saw her through the window and lunged, not for the door, but for her. He smashed the rest of the window frame with the butt of his pistol and reached in for her. Clara fired her rifle, but the angle was awkward. The shot went wide, grazing his arm. He roared in pain and fury and grabbed the front of her shift, pulling her hard against the jagged remnants of the window frame. She cried out as the broken wood bit into her back. With a powerful heave, he threw her sideways. She was ripped from his grasp and sent tumbling off the side of the porch, landing hard on the packed earth below. The impact knocked the wind from her lungs, and her rifle skittered away into the darkness. "Clara!" Calder's shout was a raw cry of anguish. He forgot about cover, forgot about tactics. He saw her lying exposed on the ground, and his own ghost, the memory of Emmeline's screams, rose up to claim him. He burst out onto the porch, firing his rifle at the man who was now turning his pistol toward Clara. His shot hit the man square in the chest. The man staggered back, a look of shocked surprise on his face, before collapsing in a heap. But in that same instant, another muzzle flashed from the darkness. Calder felt a white-hot sledgehammer blow to his left shoulder. The force of it spun him around, and his rifle clattered to the porch floor. He grunted in pain, his left arm suddenly useless, a searing fire spreading through his chest and back. He staggered but did not fall. Through a haze of pain, he saw Clara scrambling to her feet. "Get inside!" he yelled, his voice strained. He drew his own pistol with his good right hand and fired back into the darkness. Clara didn't run. She scrambled toward him, her face a pale mask of terror in the chaotic moonlight. "You're hit!" "Get inside!" he roared again, just as another bullet tore a chunk of wood from the porch post beside his head. She grabbed his belt with one hand and retrieved his fallen rifle with the other. He leaned on her, his weight a dead thing, and together they stumbled back into the relative safety of the cabin. She slammed the door and dropped the heavy bar into place just as a bullet punched through the thick wood. She helped him to the floor, away from the windows. His shirt was already soaked with blood, a dark, spreading stain. She tore a strip of cloth from her dress, her hands shaking so badly she could barely tie the knot. "You can't die," she sobbed, pressing the makeshift bandage against the wound. "Calder, please, you can't die. You stayed. You promised me tomorrow." He gritted his teeth, his face pale and beaded with sweat. "Not dead yet," he gasped. "Outside," a voice boomed, thick with rage and triumph. It was Virgil Crane. "It's over, Branson. You're wounded, and you're outnumbered. Send out the girl, and I might let you live to see a hangman's noose." A heavy thud shook the door. And another. He was trying to break it down. Calder tried to push himself up, to raise his pistol, but a wave of dizziness washed over him, and he slumped back against the wall, his eyes fluttering closed. "No," Clara whispered, her tears falling onto his face. "No, no, you don't let go." The wood of the door began to splinter. Another blow, and the bar cracked. Clara looked from Calder's pale face to the failing door. The ice she had felt in her soul when she had shot the scarecrow now spread through her veins. Her fear was still there, a cold, hard knot in her stomach, but something else rose with it, a white-hot, protective rage. She picked up her rifle. Her hands were perfectly steady. With a final, shattering crash, the door burst inward. Virgil Crane stood on the threshold, a hulking silhouette against the dark night. He held a pistol in his hand, and a cruel, victorious smirk was on his face. He stepped into the room, his eyes falling on Calder's slumped form, then on Clara. He laughed, a low, ugly sound. Well, look at that. The little mouse holding a gun." He took another step into the room. "Did you really think you could run from me? Did you really think this broken-down killer could protect you? You belong to me. You always have." He raised his pistol, pointing it not at her, but at Calder. "Now, drop the rifle, or I'll finish what my man started." Clara looked at the man she had feared for so long. She looked at his smug, possessive face, and she felt no fear at all, only a profound, liberating contempt. "I don't belong to you," she said, her voice ringing with a clarity that surprised them both. "I don't belong to anyone." "Put the gun down, girl," he sneered, his arrogance blinding him to the change in her. "You don't have the nerve." "No," she said, and she fired. The shot was deafening in the small cabin. Virgil screamed, a high, shocked sound, and his pistol clattered to the floor. He staggered backward, clutching his leg, a dark stain spreading rapidly across his thigh. She had not aimed for his heart. She had aimed for the thing that had carried him here, the thing that had allowed him to hunt her down. She had disabled him. The sound of the shot seemed to rouse Calder. His eyes snapped open. He saw Virgil on the ground, Clara standing over him with the rifle, her face fierce and resolute. With a groan, he pushed himself up the wall with his good arm. He rose, bloodied, swaying, but alive. He kicked Virgil's fallen pistol away and, with the last of his strength, drew back his fist and knocked the man unconscious. The silence that followed was absolute. Then, from the distance came a new sound, the thunder of approaching horses. Too many to be the remaining thugs. A few minutes later, Sheriff Gable and a posse of half a dozen men reined in their horses in front of the cabin. The sheriff dismounted, his gun drawn, his face grim. He took in the scene, the bodies outside, the splintered door, the blood. He stepped inside and saw Virgil, unconscious on the floor. Calder slumped against the wall, and Clara, still holding the rifle, her small frame radiating a defiant strength. "What in God's name happened here?" the sheriff demanded. Before Clara could answer, another man pushed his way into the room. It was Preacher Evans. He was holding a crumpled, tear-stained letter in his hand. "The truth, Sheriff," the preacher said, his voice shaking but firm. "The truth is what happened." He handed the letter to Sheriff Gable. The sheriff read it by the light of the lantern, his expression shifting from confusion to a slow, dawning comprehension, and finally to a grim resolve. He looked at Virgil, then at Clara. "This letter claims fraud, conspiracy, and assault."
"It's the truth," Clara said, her voice steady. "Every word of it."
The sheriff holstered his pistol. "Put him in irons," he said to one of his deputies, gesturing to the groaning form of Virgil Crane, "and round up the rest of them, the ones that can still walk." As the deputies hauled Virgil away, the chaos and the adrenaline finally receded, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. Clara's rifle suddenly felt impossibly heavy. She let it fall to the floor. She staggered over to Calder and collapsed to her knees beside him, her strength gone. She leaned her head against his good shoulder, the smell of his blood and sweat filling her senses.
"He was alive. They were alive?"
She looked into his pained but lucid eyes, and a single, ragged sob of relief escaped her.
"You didn't let go,"
she whispered, her hand finding his. "You stayed." The weeks that followed were a quiet, painful landscape of healing. Calder's recovery was slow, a stubborn uphill climb. The bullet had torn through muscle and missed the bone by a fraction of an inch, a piece of brutal luck that had saved his arm but left him weak and feverish for days. In the hazy, pain-filled hours, he would drift in and out of consciousness, and every time he opened his eyes, Clara was there. She was a constant, steady presence in the small, shadowed room. She was no longer the trembling girl hiding behind a blanket. She tended to him with a competence that was fierce and gentle all at once. She learned to clean and dress the wound, her touch firm and sure, her face set with a concentration that left no room for fear. She brewed willow bark tea to fight the fever and spoon-fed him broth when he was too weak to lift his head. She sat by his bed through the long nights, her hand resting lightly on his good arm, a silent anchor in his sea of pain. He was a difficult patient. The helplessness chafed at him, a constant, irritating reminder of his failure to protect them. He was a man accustomed to solving his problems with his own two hands. And now those hands were useless. He would watch her, his frustration a bitter taste in his mouth, as she split kindling for the fire or hauled buckets of water from the creek. Tasks that were his. He saw the new strength in her shoulders, the calluses on her hands, the unwavering resolve in her eyes, And in his weakness, he saw her more clearly than ever before. He was not looking at a girl he had rescued. He was looking at his equal, a woman who had faced down her own demons and his, and had emerged from the fire not unscathed, but unbroken. "You should have let me go to town," he grumbled one afternoon, a few weeks into his recovery. As she helped him sit up, the pain in his shoulder was now a dull, grinding ache instead of a searing fire. "You would have fallen off your horse before you even cleared the valley," she replied, her tone matter-of-fact as she plumped the pillow behind his back. There was no deference in her voice, only a calm, unassailable logic. He grunted, unable to argue. He watched as she moved about the cabin, her steps light but purposeful. She had become the heart of this small, wounded place, and he realized with a startling clarity that his healing was not just in his shoulder. It was in the quiet, steady rhythm of her presence, a balm on the old, scarred places in his soul. With Virgil Crane and his men in the custody of the law, the immediate threat was gone. But the larger world still existed just over the ridge. News of the shootout, and more importantly, the contents of Clara's letter had spread through Dry Creek and the surrounding territories. Jed, the old trapper, had been true to his word. Hearing of the trouble, he had ridden straight to the preacher's house. Preacher Evans, armed with Clara's testimony and a newfound courage born of shame, had read the letter aloud to Sheriff Gable in front of a dozen witnesses at the Mercantile. The truth, once let out of its cage, was a wild and powerful thing. The town, which had been so quick to condemn Clara and Calder, was now forced to look at its own reflection. The whispers changed their tune. Virgil Crane was no longer just a hard man. He was a criminal, a brute who had bought a girl and then tried to hunt her like an animal when she dared to defy him. The story of Calder's intervention was retold, no longer as a kidnapping, but as a singular act of courage. But a town's memory is a fickle thing, and its conscience is easily soothed. When their supplies finally ran low and Calder was still not strong enough to make the journey, Clara knew what she had to do. The thought of returning to Dry Creek sent a tremor of the old fear through her, but she pushed it down. She was not the same person who had arrived there in a dusty wedding dress. She rode the mare into town on a bright, cloudless morning. She held her head high, her back straight, her gaze fixed ahead. The whispers still followed her, but they were different now. She saw the women on the boardwalk stop their conversations to watch her pass, their expressions a mixture of awe and a kind of prurient curiosity. The men who had once looked at her with flat, appraising eyes now looked away, a flicker of shame in their faces. At the Mercantile, Mrs. Gable, the sheriff's wife, was behind the counter. She was a stern, stout woman who had never given Clara more than a cursory glance before. "Today," she looked at Clara, at her plain patched dress and the steady set of her jaw, and her own expression softened. "We heard what happened," Mrs. Gable said, her voice low as she measured out flour into a sack. "About Mr. Crane. It was a terrible business." She paused, her hands still. "Some of us, we should have spoken up. We're sorry for that." It was not a grand apology, but it was an acknowledgement, a small crack in the wall of the town's indifference. Clara simply nodded, her throat too tight for words. She paid for her supplies and left. As she was tying the sacks to her saddle, one of the women who had pitied her from a distance on her first day approached her. "You are a brave girl," the woman said, her voice barely a whisper, before hurrying away as if she had committed a great transgression. Not all the encounters were so kind. She saw other faces that looked at her with suspicion, with the old judgment. She was still the woman who had run off with a man, the woman who had brought bloodshed with her. She was a disruption, a reminder of the ugly truths that lay just beneath the surface of their quiet lives. She ignored them. Their opinions were no longer the cage that defined her world. When she returned to the valley, the sun was low, painting the sky in hues of orange and purple. Calder was sitting on the newly repaired porch, his arm in a sling, his face etched with worry. He had been watching the trail for hours. The relief that washed over his features when he saw her was so profound it made her heart ache. He helped her unload the supplies with his good hand, listening in silence as she recounted her trip to town, the quiet apology, the lingering stares. He saw the toll the day had taken on her, the faint shadows of the old fear in her eyes. That night, as they sat by the fire, he turned to her, his expression serious. "We don't have to stay here, Clara," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Crane will be in prison for a long time, but the memory of him is here. The town, it will never fully let you be. We can sell this place, sell my other ranch. We can go somewhere new. Oregon. Maybe somewhere no one knows our names." He was offering her an escape, a clean slate. It was the thing he thought she must surely want. It was the most selfless, protective gesture he could make. She looked at him, and then she looked around the small, warm cabin. She saw the curtains she had stitched, the mantelpiece she kept free of dust, the hearth that had warmed them through the long nights of his fever. She thought of the valley outside, of the creek where the mint grew, of the garden where her small, stubborn vegetables were finally taking root. She thought of the ride to town, of facing down the whispers and the stares, not as a victim, but as a survivor. She reached out and gently touched the back of his hand. "When you found me, all I wanted to do was run," she said, her voice soft but filled with an unshakable certainty. "I would have run until my feet bled, until I collapsed. But I'm not that person anymore. Running doesn't get you home." She looked into his eyes, and he saw the depth of her transformation, the unassailable strength of her will. "This is our home, Calder. We fought for it. We bled for it. I am not going to be run off from the first place that has ever felt like it was mine." She smiled, a small, sad, beautiful smile. "This time, I choose to stay." His heart, a thing he had thought long dead and buried, seemed to swell in his chest. He had offered her the world, and she had chosen this small, broken piece of it. She had chosen him. Her choice changed everything. It was no longer a place of refuge, a temporary sanctuary. It was a foundation, and so they began to build. "We need more light," Clara said one morning. A few months later, as Calder's shoulder healed and his strength returned, "This cabin is too dark." And so they decided to add a new section to the ranch, a real bedroom, not just a small, dark room at the back of the cabin, a room with wide windows that would face the east to catch the morning sun. The work was hard, but it was a joyous labor. They felled the trees themselves, Calder's axe swinging with a renewed strength, Clara helping him with the two-man saw, their movements finding a shared, easy rhythm. They peeled the logs and notched them, their hands working together. He, with his knowledge of building, would show her what to do, and she, with her quick, determined intelligence, would learn. They were partners in a way that went deeper than words. They were building not just a room, but a future, log by painstaking log. As the walls went up, Clara worked on the inside. She stitched curtains of fine white cotton she had bought in town, her needle flying, each stitch a testament to her hope. She wove a rug of colorful rags to cover the floor. The room took shape, a bright, airy space that was a physical manifestation of the new life they were creating. It was a room born not of necessity, but of want, a room for them. The seasons turned. The harsh sun of summer softened into the golden light of autumn. The cottonwoods by the creek turned a brilliant yellow. One night, a storm rolled in from the plains, the first of the season. The wind howled, and the rain beat against the cabin in furious sheets. But inside, in their newly finished room, a fire crackled in the new, small fireplace, and the air was warm and safe. Clara was sitting on the edge of the bed, brushing her hair by the firelight. Calder came and knelt before her. He was quiet for a long moment. The only sounds, the storm outside and the crackling of the logs. He took her hand, the one that was no longer soft and pale, but calloused and capable. In his other hand, he held out a small, simple ring, carved from the pale wood of a cottonwood tree, sanded so smooth it shone like polished bone in the flickering light. He looked up at her, his face stripped bare of all its old defenses, his eyes full of a raw, vulnerable emotion that made her breath catch in her throat. "That first night," he began, his voice a low, rough whisper. "You asked for one night to sleep without shaking." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles. "I was a fool. I thought I could give you that one night and then walk away. But one night turned into all the nights I ever wanted." Tears welled in Clara's eyes, bright and warm. "I love you, Clara," he said, the words feeling new and momentous in his mouth. "I know I'm not. I am a broken man, with more ghosts than I can count. But what's left of me is yours, if you'll have it." She couldn't speak. She could only nod, the tears spilling over and tracing paths down her cheeks. He slipped the simple wooden ring onto her finger. It was a perfect fit. "Yes," she finally whispered, her voice choked with emotion. She leaned forward and kissed him, a deep, lingering kiss that tasted of wood smoke and rain and a love that had been forged in the crucible of violence and sorrow. When she pulled back, she was smiling through her tears. "But no preacher, Calder, no ceremony." She looked around the warm, fire-lit room, at the white curtains she had made, at the man kneeling before her. "This is our church, and the stars can be our witnesses." He rose and sat beside her on the bed, pulling her close, as the thunder rolled in the distance, a deep, resonant rumble. She reached over to the small table beside the bed. She picked up his hat, the one he had bought in town to replace the one he had left on the floor of that saloon room, a lifetime ago. She set it down on the table, a simple, domestic act that was laden with a profound and final meaning. He watched her, a slow, deep smile spreading across his face. "That's where it belongs," he said, his voice soft. He drew her into his arms, and they held each other as the storm raged outside. They were no longer haunted by shame or silence, no longer pursued by the ghosts of their past. They were bound by something more powerful, something fierce and enduring that they had built together, out of the ashes of survival and the slow, steady work of sacrifice. The final scene did not come in the thunder of a storm, but in the quiet promise of a new day. A few months later, as winter's chill began to recede from the valley, Clara stood on the porch of their home. The sun was just beginning to rise, spilling a pale, rosy light over the eastern ridge, chasing the last of the shadows from their land. The air was cold and clean. She drew it deep into her lungs, a breath of peace, of belonging. Her hand rested gently on her belly, where a new life, a new beginning, was quietly growing. A quiet, strong smile formed on her lips. She was no longer running. She was home. Thank you for joining us around the campfire for this story. Let us know where you are listening from in the comments to connect with fellow wanderers. And be sure to subscribe to the Wild West Campfire channel and share your thoughts in English.